in recent months and years a decidedly high number of reports of people's deaths that are surprising. Now, obviously, there's nothing new about this, and I have used the example of John Ritter, the comedian, who died suddenly on the set of his sitcom of an aortic dissection. I've forgotten how many years ago that was, but it was long before there was anything like COVID in the world, certainly long before there was anything vaccine-like. And so I use this...
mRNA vaccine-like.
Yeah, right, exactly. mRNA vaccine or mRNA vaccine, as the case may be. I use that because I know that if John Ritter had died in 2022, it would have been very difficult for people to accept. He's a Hollywood guy. He will have gotten COVID vaccinated.
Yep.
Aortic dissection. He was a healthy guy. Yada, yada, yada. People would have concluded that it had been the result of that technology, and it wouldn't have been, because obviously he died of it before that technology had ever been deployed. So there's obviously lots of deaths, which if they happen in a particular context, people will see them as the result of some new process. But because they happen before the processes are there, we can be certain that we have a baseline of these things, and lots of people just simply die. But then there's a question of, okay, you see a number of deaths of people, and the question is, at what point does the number in your circle imply that some force is present that you should be thinking about? And this has now become a problem because there are many of us who have focused on the hazard of the so-called COVID vaccines and the phenomenon, apparently, of sudden deaths that seem to be downstream of these shots. But we don't want to have a confirmation bias where we view every death as this because we weren't doing a good job of paying attention to the baseline, or because we're now doing a better job of paying attention to people who have died as a result of whatever cause. We are now tracking these things in a way that we didn't track them before we worried about this. And so anyway, I wanted to provide some toolkit for how to think about these things. And Zach, you want to show this? These are some things that showed up. We were up here in the San Juan Islands. Just show those couple that I sent you. These were just things that showed up on a Facebook group. Here is a local herbalist who died, Ryan Drum. Show the other one. Here's somebody I think I had encountered a couple of times, but I didn't really know him. He was a local nature photographer. People were very sad about his death. The implication was that it was unexpected. Now, neither of these are young men. They were clearly older. Here's something that crossed my feed. This is David Icke's daughter, apparently died at 48. Now, the question is, what does one do with all of this? Maybe we're seeing more death because people are posting it more. Maybe we see more death because the circle that we are paying attention to is larger. I know that this is true in many of our cases, just by virtue of the way the internet works and the fact that we accumulate a larger circle of people that we follow. We tend to follow more people than we remove from our followed list. So there are lots of processes that could cause you to encounter more deaths. So you would have the impression that people are dying unexpectedly at a greater rate. Let's say you've got a pattern like, it seems to me that people are dying unexpectedly at a higher rate than I am used to, and that seems to match a change in our behavior, the public health response to COVID, for example. Okay, the problem is, if I'm stuck with my anecdotal encounter with the world and this pattern, and we could do the same thing for the pattern of violence in our cities, then I have no way of decisively answering the question. The only thing I can do is say, does the pattern continue to anecdotally match the predictions of the model I have that there is something new and dangerous loose in the world?
Right.
So what I wanted to do now is show what you do if you actually want to take that anecdotal pattern and the hypothesis that results from it and get rigorous. And if you would show, there was a excellent talk at the COVID summit in Romania. I'm not going to show you the talk. It's worth the 25 minutes or so to watch it. But this is Dennis Raincourt. That's what it looked like in the auditorium. And Dennis Raincourt is a physicist who has gone and analyzed the all-cause mortality data from around the world. He's looked at countries, different countries. He's looked at very different time scales. And so here, take a look. This is the pattern of all-cause mortality by month over 100 years.
70. But okay. Yep.
What you'll see is a pattern of spikes and troughs that your mind will correctly register as highly regular. Now, what that highly regular pattern is an oscillation of seasons. And for reasons that Raincourt correctly points out are not fully understood, there is an increasing all-cause mortality. That means we don't care what you died of. The question is, we just count deaths and we look at the pattern. People tend to die in the winter, and they tend to die much less in the summer, and the exact reason for that is not perfectly understood. Now, I would argue that the likely explanation for this is somewhere in the neighborhood of we all have some proximity to death at every moment, a force with which the grave pulls at us. That force is quite strong in the first year of life. It decreases radically over that year. If you survive to 1 year of age, that force pulling you towards the grave tends to be flat until you reach the age of sexual maturity, at which point it begins to very gradually, and then with an accelerating pattern, increase until it's quite precipitous late in life. And then there is arguably a plateau, largely due to what is likely a decrease in your risk of cancer if you live through the period in which cancer has skyrocketed. But in any case, interesting that the data, if you plot it out, reveal this highly regular pattern. And as predicted, this is Northern Hemisphere, this is France data you're looking at here. Very interesting, and of course necessary that it be this way. If we look at the Southern Hemisphere, where the pattern of seasons is inverted, then the pattern of spikes and troughs is inverted, as it would have to be. Otherwise, the explanation would be falsified by it. So anyway, that's what the general pattern looks like. Can you show the next graph?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Okay, so maybe I didn't capture the other graph. You want to show his bulleted list then?
Oh, yes.
So here is the upshot from this extremely carefully done research. And I want to call your attention to especially number 4 on this list. 17 million vaccine deaths worldwide to the present, plus or minus 500,000. That is an incredibly high number. Now, of course, the number of inoculations given was staggering. You know, obviously, we're not just talking about billions of people who were inoculated, but many of them inoculated multiple times. Elsewhere in this talk, and again, I encourage you to go look at it, he points out that the risk goes up rather precipitously with the number of doses you've had becoming quite high at the fourth dose.
Interesting. I wasn't there. I haven't seen the talk. But the fifth point on this list, fatal toxicity is exponential with age, with the risk of death doubling every 4 to 5 years of age. That is not counter to, but is the opposite direction of what we have talked about anecdotally, what it seems to be the case, not with regard to fatality, but adverse events, wherein in 2022, when we were talking about the insanity of giving these vaccines to young people, the point was that COVID is simultaneously a disease that does not affect the young very much, and these vaccines seem to produce a greater number of adverse events in the young. Now, we never said that it tends to kill the young more,
Right.
But that the myocarditis and pericarditis, specifically in young men, and potentially menstrual and pregnancy issues in young women, just because that's a young woman's situation, but is more of an issue in youth, whereas he's finding fatal toxicity increasing with age.
So I wanted to actually navigate that a little bit.
Yeah.
And this, I'm drawing from the research that I did back when I was doing the telomere work and deeply embedded in the evidence surrounding senescence.
Yeah.
Now, senescence, which begins at the age of first reproduction, or average age of first reproduction for your species, and continues to accelerate through life with additional years. That process is the empirical description of the vulnerability that I was just describing, the force that is pulling you towards the grave. Now, on your 20th birthday, the force that is pulling you towards the grave is so weak. Now, if you're a male, you may be inclined to risky behaviors, and we can argue about what that pattern is. But from the point of view of the failure of your biological systems at a critical level that would cause you to die, the force is extremely weak at 20, especially in the prior world before all of the novel influences. You might now be a 20-year-old with a metabolic disease that would make you much more vulnerable. But historically speaking, you would have had a very low degree of decrepitude at 20, right? Maybe only a few years and accelerating at a very low rate. And as you get older, the degree to which your systems are compromised by this goes up and up and up. And so if you imagine, as Dr. Raincourt points out in his talk, if you imagine that the mRNA vaccines function as a toxin, and I'm not sure that's exactly the right description. They are toxic, but they are more than that because of the way they interact with the immune system. But
they're not inert.
yeah, they are a complex toxin.
The toxin that keeps on giving.
Indeed. But anyway, the point is, if you imagine that every person that you encounter is, if you could look above their heads and there was a number that indicated the degree to which the grave was pulling on them, then you would say, well, if you were to administer a toxin broadly across all of them, some of them, that number at which the grave is pulling towards them is so high that it won't take very much,
Sure.
right? Now, that's the same thing that we likely see in the seasonal pattern, right? If you're very, very close to death, then, the insults that come along with winter, right, might be enough to do it. If you're very healthy and young, then it's not going to. And so, in any case, I think in part we are hampered in our ability to understand what's going on because death is such a focus. And the problem is death is a binary thing, whereas damage is not, right? So to the extent that something damaging has been released on the public and that is measurable in the death of people who were close enough in proximity to the grave that it pushed them over the edge, right? And it will very rarely get somebody who's perfectly healthy, and it will very frequently get people who were headed that direction anyway. And so we need a better toolkit to think about these things. But my larger point is, if you anecdotally think that you're seeing a pattern, you're being denied information on what that pattern is. You're not allowed to know what these people died of. Therefore, if you start saying, oh, it's another died suddenly, and somebody says, aha, this person was sick for 7 years.
Right.
It's not a died suddenly as a result of these inoculations because they were sick long before these inoculations had ever been given to anybody. Okay, you win. But if you were interested in figuring out, okay, to what degree were these things causing that harm? is the fact that I seem to be seeing not only anomalies in the number of people who seem to be dying, but also, tragically, the number of people who seem to be reporting serious disruptions of pregnancy.
Yeah.
Right? So, again, do they happen under normal circumstances? Of course. Probably some of that normally happening during normal circumstances is actually the result of other novel phenomena, toxins in the environment, and who knows, metabolic diseases, whatever the novel influences are. And then there would be, in an ancestral environment that was free of all those novel influences, presumably a very tiny rate of those things. Why? In large measure because the body is built to not invest in projects that are fatally compromised. And so there's a very high rate of spontaneous abortion, which presumably is a result of the fact that the body is looking at a pregnancy that's underway and deciding whether it's a good enough bet to continue to invest in it. So anyway, there are elegant systems in the body. They're disrupted by novelty. The fact that the public health campaign appears to have created a huge quantity of excess death, something like 17 million people globally, and that's not even the cost of the public health campaign. That is the apparent vaccine-induced deaths to date. So think about, in light of the model we've just put forward, think about what that actually implies. If damage was done by these inoculations to a large fraction of the people who received them, and some small fraction of those people were being pulled towards the grave at a strong enough level that they disappeared and they ended up in our statistics, then the question is, how many years of life are people actually being robbed of? Yeah. What's the net effect? And what is the total number of excess deaths that will ultimately be attributable to this public health campaign? So all of those things are interesting, in addition to the deaths that were the result of other interventions that were mandated, ventilators. And then there's the question, the even more difficult question. This one, I don't exactly know how you study it, but there's the question of, given the treatments that turn out to work that were denied to people,
yeah,
in order, presumably, to get them to accept these inoculations, what would the number of excess deaths have been?
How much lower would the excess mortality rate be had drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine been administered more freely?
Absolutely, which is affected by something that Raincourt says in the beginning of his talk, which is that you actually do not see a spike of excess deaths that are related to COVID, that they seem to be related to the measures that were mandated in the aftermath of its announcement.
Right. And this, boy, did they get that vaccine to us very, very fast. And had they been able to put together a story in which the vaccine arrived exactly coincident with the virus, then we would not have the control group. Then we could not say, this is excess mortality from COVID, which is to say, oops, 2020, basically nothing. And this is excess mortality after the mRNA technology was deployed. If those two things had shown up at the same moment, we couldn't compare, and all of this would be attributed to the disease.
Yep. All right. Now there's further road we can go down, but I think this is maybe a good place to put this on pause for now, with the understanding that what we have done is we have taken the anecdotal experience of a person who doesn't know how to think about this. We have talked about, from that, formulating a hypothesis that then is in need of a test, and then the fact that that test can actually come in the form of large data sets that capture unambiguous events like death and show us that in fact, whether or not the specific deaths that caused us to formulate that hypothesis were caused by this exact thing, that they are completely consistent with the idea that there is a new force, that it is a hazard, that we are justified in focusing our attention on these deaths. Our morbid curiosity in this case is a survival instinct. That's it. It's a survival instinct. And that to deny you the information that allows that survival instinct to gather appropriate information is a crime in and of itself.